Thank you, everyone, for coming out again in such huge numbers despite the weather. For 2 days, we had crazy heat, and the sun wasn't going away, and suddenly it's poured. But it's great to see the audience out here. I've had the pleasure of actually interviewing Shashi Tharoor almost every year or every other year on a book that he's written. So it kind of feels like he writes one every 6 months. But this is one of the most fun books of his that I've had a chance to read. Because this is basically Shashi Tharoor, advice that you're giving to all of us on life, on things that you've experienced based on your own experiences and that of your co-author, Joseph Zacharias, who's a good friend of yours. And the best part about it is it's written very simply. They're one-liners. They're very witty. How did the idea for this actually begin? Where did it start?
It started actually with my publisher, David Davidar, who felt that a lot of my writing and speaking involved statements that could be called aphorisms. An aphorism is a short, pithy observation that is supposed to combine both wit and wisdom, and that combines some wisdom in ideally a witty way, and that imparts some lesson to the reader. And he wanted me to do that, and I kind of said, yes, no, well, I'm not going to sit around churning out aphorisms. And I didn't do it. And then after a year or two had gone by from David offering that idea, out of the blue and without any warning, I get this email from a former collaborator, good friend who'd stayed in touch. He'd worked with me in Thiruvananthapuram earlier, a man called Joseph Zacharias, who's a wonderful, eccentric, kind of gnomic individual. He looks like an overgrown gnome, as I've said in the book. And he comes up with these flashes of insight every day. So he wrote to me saying, I have written a book of aphorisms and I need your advice on how to get it published. So I thought, God, two birds with one stone, right? I sent Joseph's aphorism manuscript to David, and I said, David, I didn't do what you wanted me to do. I didn't do a book of aphorisms, but here's somebody who has. Why don't you publish that instead? So David read it and came back to me saying, look, I think about half will work. The other half doesn't work for me. So he turned the challenge back to me and said, why don't you, since you didn't find the time to write a whole book of aphorisms, why don't you write half a book and we can put them together and create a book of aphorisms? So I first told Joseph, look, you have every right to withdraw your manuscript and try another publisher. I just thought of David because I know he's interested in aphorisms and he is my publisher. But when Joseph heard of this idea, he leapt at it and insisted that I do join him in co-authoring this book. So I found some time at some point in the course of the year to come up with some aphorisms myself. I also culled a few from my own previous writings and speeches. And the whole thing put together was given to David, who imposed a very interesting shape on it by grouping the aphorisms in sort of collective themes: friendship, relationships, love, work, India, whatever. And so the resultant book is the less you preach, the more you learn, which is one of the aphorisms. It's slightly whimsical, and some of the things we don't necessarily 100% agree with each other on every one of them, because what David has very sensibly done is he's given a key at the end that says which aphorisms are Joseph's and which are mine and which are truly collaborative. The collaborative ones essentially involved my rewriting something of Joseph's, where I had a similar thought and was a question of putting it together in sort of some cogent language. But at the end of the day, we had great fun with this, and it's been even made more fun, as Nidhi says, because it's also sort of amusingly illustrated with sort of cartoons illustrating some of the one-liners. So anyway, that's what it is, and I'm sure with the course of this conversation, you'll get a little taste of the kinds of things in the book, and we hope you'll read it.
I've actually marked, some of the ones that I wanted to talk to you about. I don't know if we'll get through all of them. And I think these are the ones that you've written. I looked at the index.
Oh, dear.
You've also quoted Kofi Annan, your former boss
Yes.
at the United Nations. And there are some really nice ones attributed to him. So I want to begin with one of those.
Right.
Where he said that if the sharks bite you, do not bleed.
That's right.
And you've written here that it took me years to understand what he meant. Now explain to us what that means, and especially personally what that meant for you, because you have faced a lot of personal
That's right.
and political challenges over the years. And how did listening to this help you?
Well, Kofi Annan was this amazingly yogic figure. I mean, I knew him extremely well. We saw more of each other during the typical day than most husbands and wives get to see of each other. So it was a very close working relationship for several years. And in the course of that, he peppered me with lots of wisdom, much of which he attributed to his father, who was a Ghanaian tribal chief, and a lot of which he said were as ancient Ghanaian tribal wisdom. So some of these things I have not quoted. I mean, there are similar equivalents in other cultures. But some of the things he told me that were truly, totally, to me, original, have been put in the book, and he's been quoted. This is one of them. And it happened at a time when he was coming under withering and, I believe, grossly unfair attack from a section of the world media, particularly in the US at that time. And he was, you know, you could see he was in personal pain and distress, but he was very good at concealing that, or at not giving the impression of it just going on seemingly unflappable through his normal day. And when I sort of commiserated with him about what he was going through, he turned to me and said, "When the sharks bite you, do not bleed," is something his father had taught him. And I said, "But Kofi, what do you mean by that? I mean, when the sharks bite you, of course you'll bleed. Isn't that what happens when sharks bite?" And he said, "One day, I'm afraid you will know personally what that means." And that day came years later when I was in Indian politics and the subject of some incredibly malicious vilification, equally unfair about some things I not only had not done, would never have conceived of being able to do, when suddenly this came back to me and hit me right between the eyes. When the sharks bite you, what do they want to? They want to see you bleed. It's in your bleeding that the sharks get their satisfaction. So I realized at that point in my political life that Kofi's wisdom would stand me in good stead if I simply refused to let the sharks see me bleeding. If I would actually, I mean, the British talk about grace under pressure and so on. It's very simple. Let the sharks bite. You just carry on, unfazed, doing what you're there to do. And at the end of the day, when they see you're not bleeding, they will stop biting. And that eventually is what happened. It's a tough thing to go through.
I was going to say that's easier said than done, isn't it? Are you saying that you internalized it, those challenges, those storms that you faced at that point? I mean, did you sit in your room, and hold your head sometimes and, get frustrated, even if you didn't show it outwardly? And you never did.
Yeah, no, I didn't. And what's more, I insisted on working hard and attending to my constituency and being productive in terms of books and writing and speeches and all of that. And I'm glad to say that in turn became the public perception rather than all the malice. So that was important. But I mean, I can tell you about Kofi that at the worst of it, he literally lost his voice. He had internalized the suffering so much that it hit him in that way. I don't know which of my internal organs was packed up, but maybe I'll find out one day.
This is another one which I really liked. The more humility a man expresses in public, the greater his private opinion of himself.
Yeah,
Is there anyone in particular that you were referring to?
Not thinking of anyone in particular, but we come across this a lot in people of consequence, particularly in India and particularly in Indian politics, right? This air of humility, which is usually transparently insincere. So that's what I'm referring to.
So you're very honest that is something you come across a lot in Indian politics. Everyone is going out of their way to say how humble they are, how much humility they have. And coffee is important too, so let's sort that out.
Absolutely, yeah. Keep the throat. Nidhi and I have just been talking in the previous panel, so we can lubricate ourselves a bit.
So
Nidhi, there was another Kofi Annan one which I might quote back.
I know, I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
But I like this one. Was this yours or Joseph's? I don't know. Never drink with the boss. Do not carry his bags either.
That's Joseph. Joseph was, for a while, a civil...
You were his boss, right?
I was.
So was this a reference to you?
It certainly was his approach, I mean, whereas it wasn't mine. I mean, not only did I drink with Kofi Annan more than once, but he was gracious enough to invite me and my family to his country cottage on a weekend and cook for us. So we had a different kind of relationship. But Joseph, having worked in the Indian bureaucracy in Delhi, I think knew exactly what he meant. And the idea was both ways. Don't try and be too friendly to the boss, and at the same time, don't be too unctuous and too servile, carry his bags and so on. Because those are the two traits that he found he saw most in wannabe civil servants in India. And it's something which other civil servants can comment on. I had not worked in India in that capacity, and so I didn't relate to that because certainly at the UN we had a very collegial and sort of friendly relationship with our bosses. I was a bit startled when I first joined the UN at the ripe old age of 22 to be asked by my boss to call him by his first name. But that's the culture elsewhere. In India, it's not.
You have to say, sir. What's it like with your boss now?
G.
Okay. So coming back to Kofi Annan's quotes, maybe you're referring to this one. Never hit a man on the head if
That's
you
right.
have your fingers between his teeth. I like this one.
Yeah,
Tell us what
it's
this
a great line. Again, comes from Ghana, apparently, from his father. But, it again happened when we were running into some trouble with a particular member state, a rather powerful one. And I sort of asked him, why don't we just call them out for what they're doing and just openly denounce what they're doing on this? And then he turned around and came up with this line, never hit a man on the head when you've got your fingers between his teeth. Namely, if you hit him on the head and he can bite off your fingers, what do you gain, right? And the problem is, precisely for a Secretary General dealing with powerful member states of the UN, if you score a cheap point on one particular issue with a powerful member state, that member state can damage you on 4 or 5 other issues very easily, perhaps within the instant. And that's what this reference is all about. You can just imagine it for yourselves, right? If your fingers are stuck between somebody's teeth and you hit him on the head, what's going to happen? And that's precisely a lesson in life, is before you indulge in the momentary gratification of attacking someone, just see what the consequences might be for you as well.
And I believe this is one that you strongly feel about, which is that it's sometimes better to lose an argument than to lose a friend.
Yeah, no, that's something
and that's really interesting in today's times, because we are so, we live in very polarized times. Let's face it, I think all of us have had arguments with friends and family because we are so polarized about everything, about opinions. It's not just true of Indians, but all over the world. And therefore, what do? You don't challenge your friends if you disagree with them?
It's not that. Actually, the thought occurred to me when a conversation with a diplomat from a Western country about an Indian diplomat whom I considered rather brilliant and who spoke very well at the UN. And so I commented on that, and I said, he kind of eviscerated the arguments of the other side on a particular issue. And this diplomat said to me, yeah, he wins the argument, but do you think he won any friends? And that suddenly made me think. Because, of course, very often the objective of diplomacy and of human relations is not just winning every time. It is actually about persuading people to like you, because then that's the way they will eventually serve your interests. You can browbeat somebody with the brilliance of your rhetoric or the ruthless logic of your arguments. But at the end of the day, does it serve you very well if, having given them that humiliation of losing to you, you then need them to be well disposed to you? That's the point I think that particular line makes. Sometimes more important to keep the friend than to win the argument. And I think that's very true in human relationships as well.
But does that also reflect that it's become increasingly harder for us to agree to disagree?
It's a very good point.
Whether it's in politics or in our personal lives.
I think all the folks here who are in WhatsApp groups in India know exactly what you're talking about. Because very often one finds, particularly school alumni groups and college alumni groups and so on, there comes a time when either administrators ban certain subjects, or if those subjects come up, people either go silent or drop out of groups because they just find it impossible to abide by the view of some people who express themselves very strongly. That's again something that's happening a lot in our country. We don't search enough for common ground. We seem to be shielding ourselves behind unscalable ramparts of opinion, which in some cases, we believe so passionately, we don't want to give any quarter to the other side. And that, at the end of the day, is not going to help us get along either collectively in whatever group it is we're a part of, or as a country.
That's true. This happened on one of the WhatsApp groups that I was on the other day, where two colleagues violently disagreed ideologically on something, and we had to try to persuade them both to come back. They both exited. But politically as well, has that room for dialogue disappeared? has it shrunk? You know, even in Parliament, for example, it's like there's no sort of relationship between the opposition and the treasury benches anymore. Do you all sit and talk? Do you have cordial personal relationships anymore?
Not enough, and certainly not enough at the official level, where it used to be said sometimes that a Minister of Parliamentary Affairs would spend more time in the opposition benches than on his own. That isn't really happening anymore, I'm afraid, in our country. And it's more than slightly disappointing that that's the case, because it is so important, particularly when the battle lines are so clearly drawn, but also when one side has an overwhelming majority on every issue because they have the numbers, that there is an attempt made to reach out and to talk to each other. It's so essential to be able to do that, because in a democracy, at the end of the day, we aren't each other's enemies, we're each other's adversaries, and we really need to see that and to try and believe that each side has the best interests of the country at heart, just a different approach about how to fulfill those interests.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Now, I like this one, because this probably applies to a lot of journalists today, including myself. Know a little about almost everything, and everything about almost nothing, and you will make a great conversationalist.
Yeah, you can question people on anything you like, you journalists. No question about that. Yeah, but I mean, that's just a fun observation. There's nothing terribly profound about it. But people who know too much about one subject cannot be very good conversationalists, because they bore the pants off anybody whose level of interest isn't as great as their own. Whereas people who actually know a little bit about everything are fun to spend time with, right? So you'll make a great conversationalist. Now, if you're a journalist, of course, it means you can be very polyvalent and question and harass everyone, irrespective of whatever their area of expertise is. You know just enough about everybody to ask them.
Well, I know news anchors, we like to pretend that we knew everything, and we didn't. And so we pretended we knew everything. But another one I liked was, the hardest challenge for most people is to follow the advice that they give to others.
That's true.
And in your context, what is the advice that you've given that you found very difficult to follow of your own? Must be tons of it.
So many things, I think. But ultimately, the advice that I have not been able to follow, other people give it to me and I give it to others in a very well-meaning way, is to take it easy. Don't overdo things. Don't push yourself so hard. And yet I find myself doing that all the time. So it isn't easy. But it depends very much on the kind of advice you tend to give. A lot of people give good advice because they've done badly at fulfilling those standards. So they know how much it hurts to do things wrong. And because of that, they are in a position, I'd like to think that on at least one or two issues that I'm not going to talk about publicly, that I might have been able to help people very close to me to avoid making the kind of mistakes that I believe I made at an earlier stage of my life. And these were younger people. So I think that's not a bad thing either. But once you've given the advice, can you live up to it? Each of you can question yourselves about that.
There's a lovely section in the book which also, looks at quotes about, India and what India stands for. One of them is, pluralist India must, by definition, tolerate plural expressions of its many identities, which I think is so relevant in the times we live in, isn't it?
That's right. Well, that's part of my vision of India that I've articulated in a number of books and writings and speeches. And so that's unabashedly me. I genuinely grew up believing very, very much in this whole cliche of unity and diversity. I think that secularism may even have been the wrong word, because if you look up a dictionary, secularism actually means distancing yourself from religion, which is impossible in India because almost everyone in India is religious, whatever their religion may be. Most people have some sort of immersion in religious practice or religious faith or prayer or ritual or whatever. And therefore, pluralism fits it much better. That is that, as Vivekananda taught us, accept differences. You may have different ways of being a Hindu. You may have different ways of being an Indian. You maybe have a different way of just being anything you like. But as long as you respect their right to be where they are and they respect your right to be where you are, you'll get along fine and the country will flourish. That, I think, is so essential for our own survival.
But is that changing? We're living in very different times. Do you see a creeping majoritarianism? Is it creeping anymore? Is that even the right word? And what happens when, and we talked about this in the previous session, when a Residents' Welfare Association president threatens or tells somebody who has disagreed with him or a group of people to leave the colony, which is of course blatantly illegal. But what does that say about the kind of people we're becoming?
Exactly. I mean, unfortunately, we have become intolerant more and more across. Though in the particular example you're citing, fortunately, the lady in question doesn't live in the colony she was ordered to move out of, so she's all right, I think, as a result. But the fact still is that there's no constitutional right to tell people to do that. And this intolerance is at odds with not only what we've enshrined in our constitution as our democratic way of being in this country, but it's even completely the antithesis of what Swami Vivekananda said Hinduism is all about. He spoke in the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, and he said, "I'm proud to speak of you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance." And that acceptance was in many ways key to the strength of Hinduism. That we could worship the divine in 330 crore forms and names and appearances and attributes, because every one of us was as entitled to imagine the divine as we wished to, as anyone else was. And so if you wanted to, the original concept of God in Hinduism was the Nirguna Brahman, right? The divine without qualities, without form, without shape, without gender, all of that. But if you, after a few centuries, realized this wasn't enough for the ordinary people, and the ordinary people were busy worshipping rivers and mountains and trees because they needed something to focus their worship on, that's when the rishis came up with the idea of the Saguna Brahman, the God or the divine with qualities. And that became sort of the material form given to the spiritual yearning that they'd written about for centuries beforehand. And that material form, because no one could have an authoritative view of what God, quote unquote, must look like, you can actually worship God in any way you want. You want to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger? Sure, that's fine. You want to imagine God as a pot-bellied a man with an elephant's head? That's fine too. And by the same logic, if you want to imagine God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that's okay too, in the classic Hindu notion of how you reach out, which is why the acceptance of difference came easily. Vivekananda used to quote something called the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which said that just as many rivers, some straight, some winding, flow down many hills and valleys and end up in the same sea, so also all forms of worship end up at the same divine. Now, if that's your basic premise, then what's the issue, right? How does it matter if somebody calls themselves by some other religious name? They are free to be who they are, you're free to be who you are, just respect each other. But that is what is being threatened today in this kind of odious materialism, majoritarianism that you've talked about. And when Vivekananda said, for example, I can tell you one thing about Hindus, he said they may take on all sorts of penances upon themselves, but they will never light the fires of inquisition against others. And I thought, my God, can we still give that character certificate to the Hindus of today as assembled under Hindutva?
Very strongly said, Shashi Tharoor. And that actually brings me to yet another quote from Kofi Annan. He was good at this. The problem is never with the faith, but with the faithful.
That's right. I mean, that was a very good observation of his, and that wasn't from his father. He came up with it himself. Because he was referring to the fact that very often in the name of religion, people attack each other. And this is happening around the world. He wasn't referring to any particular country. The truth is, however, that every faith talks about peace and coexistence and harmony and love. There is no religion that doesn't say that it stands for all of these wonderful things. So, as Kofi said, the problem is never with the faith. It's with the faithful. If the faithful believe that my way of ensuring peace and love is better than your way of ensuring faith and love, and I will kill you to prove it, then what kind of faith and love is that? But that's the message of that aphorism.
I'm going to take a couple more, and then I'd like to open this up to the audience because I'm sure a lot of people have questions for you. So we're going to spend the last 15 minutes with the Q&A. But this one was nice. The pessimist complains about the weather. The optimist declares it will change, and the pragmatist goes out anyway with an umbrella.
Yeah, that's me.
What are you, the pragmatist?
I'm the pragmatist, yeah. I mean, actually, I remember feeling a long time ago that optimism really involves regarding the future with uncertainty. Because the pessimist says everything is bound to go wrong, we're doomed, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, and so on. But the optimist says, look, we could get this right. If we were to do this or that or this, And if this didn't happen and we didn't allow that to happen, then maybe this could all work out. That's the optimist. So the optimist is regarding the future with uncertainty and with some hope. And the pessimist is somebody who says it's all going to go down the tubes. But there is a third animal that says, well, maybe it'll do well, maybe it'll do badly, but let's prepare for the worst anyway. So the pragmatist is the one who goes out with the umbrella.
This one
Which many of you, I wish, must be wishing you had done.
I like this one because actually, let me be a bit catty here. I'll tell you why this spoke to me. The brave speak up for what they believe in. Cowards believe what they are told to speak up for. It kind of reflects so much on the state of much of the mainstream media in the country today.
I'm afraid so. That was very much sparked by contemporary public expression.
It was actually inspired by
Yeah,
that?
yeah. That was not in any of my earlier books. It's just an observation looking at what goes on in our country. And those who are brave enough to speak out often pay a terrible price for it, Nidhi. So that's what makes them brave.
It's important to let sleeping dogs lie and to attack sleeping dogmas. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, I had come up with a sort of over-smart one-liner once about let's let sleeping dogmas lie. And then I kind of decided to stretch it out for this book into something a little more because, you know the old cliche, right? Let sleeping dogs lie. If an issue is no longer being debated, doesn't have the capacity to rile people up or hurt them, just let it be. Don't stoke up a new controversy. But then the same problem arises with sleeping dogmas. And the honest truth is we're seeing too much of this in our country today. We are not prepared to leave the past where it is. Too many of us want to disinter the past and create, a wound that is healed is being gouged open to create new wounds and new injuries today for tomorrow. So that's why I came up with that thought.
I'm going to ask you one more before I open it up for questions from the audience. And this is actually what we were just talking about in the other panel. Democracy is not just elections every 5 years, but what happens between them.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I think speaks to all of us here because we're about to face one more election. And every time India has an election, it's immediately the world's largest exercise in democratic franchise. We just have more voters than anybody else. But is that enough to make us a democracy? And I would argue passionately no, because democracy is what happens between those elections. Jayaprakash Narayan, when he quit politics in the 50s, said that he was doing so because he was afraid that elections would just be a bunch of sheep electing their shepherd, who would then push them around and tell them what to do. And in some ways, there's a lot of prescience to that idea because it looks like, in many ways, that's what we're seeing. The Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden has described India not as a democracy anymore, but as an electoral autocracy, as a country where we elect our leaders freely, but then they conduct themselves as autocrats, almost as dictators, not as democrats. So what we need to do to give democracy true substance and meaning is to exercise our democratic rights between elections and not just at the ballot box. And that means holding our elected representatives accountable at all levels, whether it's your councillor, whether it's your panchayat member, whether it's your MLA, whether it's your MP, and above all, whether it's your government at the state and at the centre. Because that's their job. They are there to be accountable to you, and they are there because you put them there. And that's something we can't afford to forget if we want that notion of India being the world's largest democracy to actually mean anything substantively.
That's terrific. Let's open this up for some questions. And the lady here in the front, please, in the pink kurta. Yes, I'll come to the back, I promise. We have 15 minutes.
I have your book and read the introduction. And there you talk about aphorisms from all over the world, but not from the Upanishads. And I feel the Upanishads have a lot of aphorisms. For example, when the student is near, this teacher will appear. Is that an aphorism, and why did you not recognize Indians?
That's a wonderful one. I think probably because it simply didn't occur to me. I mean, I have obviously dipped into the Upanishads a great deal and refreshed my knowledge of some of them when I wrote Why I'm a Hindu and the Hindu Way. So it's not that that's foreign material. It's simply, it didn't occur to me. And you're quite right. I think it'll be wonderful to go back to them and coming across things like that. As to your particular choice of aphorism, you're right. When the student is near, the teacher will appear, is that kind of Upanishadic wisdom for which there is really no modern equivalent, right? That is that when you need some instruction, you will find the instructor, is perhaps the modern way of looking at it. Wonderful. Thank you, ma'am.
There's a young lady in the back in a red sweater with both her arms who's
Yes,
waving
both
wildly.
arms, both hands.
Yeah, so you can't miss her.
Vigorous.
Can we get a mic to her, please?
But I think while somebody's traveling to the back, you might give somebody a question in
Okay,
the
so
front. She's a long way.
No, she's got the mic. She's got the mic. I think there are 2-3 people there. Go ahead.
Is that okay? Perfect. Okay, I really have to say this, that I was trying to pick a book of yours, Mr. Tharoor, to get it autographed. And then I realized...
I'll be doing signings after this.
Awesome. And I realized that most of your books are really essentially about India, and they're like huge books, not less than 400 pages. And I picked up this one, okay, the less you preach, the more you learn. And I realized, this is like one-liners. Is that really your style of writing? That's one. And second, are we missing out on the stories that would go along with it? Because you've written one-liner, and I'm like, yeah, it makes sense, but what's the story?
That's
Have
a good
you missed out
question.
on
You
the
wanted to
storytelling?
know what was behind those one-liners, kind of
Yes,
what we're
where
talking
is the
about.
storytelling?
That's a tough one to answer because all the books of aphorisms I've mentioned are just like that. They're just, you're supposed to think about what the line means rather than have it explained to you as we're doing here on stage this afternoon. But don't forget that, as you say, all my books are full of all these stories. And a lot of these, not a lot, but I would say at least 10% of the aphorisms in the book, or 8 to 10%, have appeared in context in other kinds of writing. And some of them are from my fiction, some of them are from my non-fiction. The Great Indian Novel pops up a few times here, simply because I did tend to sort of toss off aphorisms while writing that. And one of my favorites, which I thought Nidhi would come up with, is the British are the only people in history crass enough to make revolutionaries out of Americans, which no laughter. Oh gosh, all right, so maybe she was right not to pick it. Anyway, so that's one of them. But what I'm saying is you can see some of those in context in a larger story. But the idea of a book like this is for you to just read the line and think about it. But do dig into one of the longer books. You might find more rewarding stories in them.
The gentleman in the green shirt, please, and the glasses. Yes. We're just getting a mic to you. Can you stand up, please? Thank you.
So, would like your opinion or a statement on this aphorism. Never interrupt an enemy when they are making a mistake in the current political discourse.
I think it's a very good line. Never interrupt an enemy when they're making a mistake, because obviously let them do it to themselves and you won't have to do it to them. But I have a feeling that you're, in the present political context, you're not being very kind to my side at the moment, and therefore I would rather not venture that. No, I mean the truth is that in many cases we do find that people make tactical blunders, and that happens in politics. But how you recover from them is what really matters. And I hope that ultimately we will be able to focus on the larger picture of what our country needs for the future. I remember when I came in for my very first electoral contest after a full career at the UN. I came for the elections of 2009. Nobody in the party that I was fighting for expected to win that election. And we won with a bigger majority than the previous time. So anything can happen in elections. I think it all depends. It's all in your hands. It's how you vote, folks, that's going to determine the outcome.
Ma'am.
Thanks a lot, sir. I am Dr. Bharti, an eye surgeon, and you already know that the doctors are going through a very tough time in India because of the great, so many things happening. Everybody knows about it. So kindly do write something, which is very strong, which supports the doctors, which supports the difficult time they have. Second thing is, my big request to you is kindly write something or give some message to the murder mystery writers, because they are writing so many books and they have basically taken away all the readers from every other aspect. So these days I am working with the disabled, and I am driving stories and the wisdom of the animals, linking them together to bring in good things to the humanity, rather than just leaving bad things to prosper. Our friend, who was a very good clinician, a diabetologist, wonderful person, he died, he committed suicide because he wrote so many good books for human beings, for the people to take care of themselves. And he
Ma'am,
was-
we might
he had
stop
to-
you
yeah,
there.
Just one
Thank
second.
you.
And he had to pay 1 lakh rupees just to keep his books in the bookshelf.
Just
My
a-
gosh, shameful.
Ju-
Okay,
ju-
on the
just
doctor.
a request. Yeah, no, just please do ask a shorter question, only because we can get more people in to ask a question. Again.
On the
but-
doctors, ma'am, as recently as yesterday, I've raised in Parliament the issue of attacks on doctors and violence on doctors and demanded the government bring in legislation. I myself have introduced a private member's bill, which I hope the government can still take up, that would extend protection to doctors. On your larger question, I mean, people, unfortunately, will read what they enjoy reading, and if they enjoy reading more murder mysteries and not enough of other things, then the rest of us who don't write murder mysteries will suffer. But, you know, you can't blame a murder mystery writer for catering to what the public wants to read.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I want to go back to the first aphorism that we talked about. The more you preach, the less you learn. So you have so much of experience. How do you still manage to not be preachy and be open to new ideas and keep learning?
Well, I've always believed the mind is kind of like a parachute, right? You don't want to jump off a plane with a closed parachute and keep it closed. And in the same ways, you don't want to enter the world with a closed mind. So I've always believed that I don't think there's been a single day of my life that I have not learned something new. It could be a new word, a new idea, a new insight into the aphorisms of the
What is
Upanishads.
the new word
whatever.
that you've learned? Please tell us.
Today I've
We
not
need to
learned.
Google it.
Today I've not learned a new word. All right, Nidhi. But I've learned, I've been reminded of a very insightful Upanishadic aphorism. So there I've learned something new. I mean, I think if you go through life with an open enough mind, you will discover there's always plenty to learn. But you've got to be receptive to it. Those antennae have got to be up there to draw from others rather than closing yourself up. I mean, I drove here from Delhi. So obviously inside the car, I wasn't learning very much. I was dealing with WhatsApp messages. So if at all I was learning anything, it was the wrong things. But the fact is that having got here, within 2 sessions, I was able to learn something. Jokes apart, all of us can learn all the time. We just have to be open to it. And the title was specifically meant for those of us, particularly the uncles, as we call them in this country, who love giving updesh, who love giving advice to everybody else, but who seem completely closed when it comes to actually being aware of themselves or even of learning anything new for themselves.
Ah, those uncles. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, sir. My name is Sairaj. Been a big fan for a while.
Thanks.
I agree with the part you mentioned towards the end about holding your government accountable through the elections or through other ways. But because the opposition is that organ through which the representative body through which we find or hold the government accountable, when the opposition today itself is a little disconcerted or disorganized or full of IRAMs and GAIARAMs, how does the public then go on to hold that government accountable? Because they do not see any representatives for that particular choice, and that's why the other choice seems more plausible to them. So how does one do that?
I see your problem, though in fact in many ways the session that Nidhi and I were just at would have partially answered your question, because the author there, Indrajit Roy, was talking about resistance. How ordinary people can resist, like the farmers resisted the laws. The opposition did oppose them in parliament, but were outvoted by the BJP majority. And when the farmers got out into the streets, and they stayed out in the streets for a year, the laws crumbled and the government had to repeal them. Similarly, we've seen other cases of protests actually holding sway. And I must say, I think the CAA protests were winning until the COVID lockdown came and everyone had to get off the streets. So there were, in many ways, opportunities where ordinary citizens were able to show how passionately they felt about something, some particular injustice. And I think no government can be totally indifferent. In a country our size, I think, no one can be indifferent to the vast sections of the public who feel strongly about something. But if you confine that feeling only to casting your ballot, then I think you're limiting the power of democracy to just one electoral exercise. Democracy is not just a one-off event. It is an ongoing process. And that process has to continue between elections and without elections, and perhaps even despite or without opposition parties. Having said that, I'd like to think that in a parliamentary system, you always have a choice in the particular constituency where you're voting. If you really want to see things change in the government, there will be one of the opposition persons, even if they haven't all agreed in just putting up one name, there will be one person who you believe, if you've taken sufficient interest in the campaign, who you believe can do a better job of articulating your feelings than the person whom you're trying to get rid of. Vote for that person. That's always possible.
We have time for just 2 more quick questions. There's a lady in the white. If you can just stand up, the mic is coming to you. Just the lady in the mic, with the mic, please. Yes.
Without the mic, we can't hear you, sir. No, you're not, ma'am.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now you are.
We can hear you.
My question to you is actually I do read books, but I haven't read any of your books.
Oh,
so
well.
if I have
You
to
and the
start,
majority of the reading public, alas.
so if I have to start, which book will you recommend?
It's like asking a parent which of your children would you recommend.
No, not like that. Okay, I'll give you some reference. Recently, I've developed interest in politics, so maybe with that reference, can you recommend any of
Okay,
your
it
books?
depends on how serious a reader you are. I'm very proud of a particular book of mine that hasn't been widely read because it came out during COVID. And that's a book called The Battle of Belonging on nationalism, patriotism, and what it means to be an Indian. I'm very proud of it because it really is a very serious and at the same time, I hope, accessibly light engagement with the profound questions of what is nationalism, what is patriotism. I tell a lot of stories, real life stories from history and from my own experience to illustrate the points I'm making. And I try and do this to get into this entire issue of what is Indian nationhood and what does it mean. When we say, garv se kaho ki aap Hindustani hai, what does it mean? And that's something we've really got to think about. I'd love to go into it greater length, but I'm conscious that we're running out of time. Do read The Battle of Belonging. You might enjoy it. It'll give you a strong orientation into our contemporary politics and what has happened to it from the time of the Constitution.
Last question. Yes, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I attended the session you did at Charbagh just now, and I have a question from that session. So you said democracy for every country, for every nation holds a different meaning. Sir, I wanted...
No, not a different meaning. There are different forms of democracy possible.
Yes,
So you can have a presidential system, you can have a parliamentary system, you can have a hybrid presidential parliamentary system, you can have the Swiss system where everyone is participating in government irrespective of their political parties. So you can have different systems, but they're all democracies. That's the point.
So you stated that we are a parliamentary system running in a presidential manner.
Being run now in a
Being
presidential...
run in a presidential manner. So seeing the 2024 elections are on head right now, how do you imagine it's going to change for India in the future?
Look, I genuinely believe that no particular political order is permanent in any country. I mean, India, is vastly larger than any one individual leader, one individual political party, or any majority. Ambedkar famously said in the Constituent Assembly, people who believe they're in the majority should remember that all majorities are by definition temporary. How temporary, we don't know. I mean, the Congress was in power for 30 years after 1947. Mr. Modi and his party may believe they're going to easily come back. We don't know. We believe that's in the hands of the people and maybe they won't come back. But even if they do, they won't be here forever. No one can be here forever. And therefore, ultimately, the way in which the system can change, young lady, the way in which the system can change would consist, it seems to me, of us being able to bring about that change through the choices we make. Now, for example, at one point, there was a serious attempt made during the previous BJP government of Mr. Vajpayee to say, why don't we change the constitution? And there was even a commission with a retired Supreme Court justice appointed to study the possibilities of that. Had they been re-elected, that might really have been a question put to the Indian people. Do you want a totally different system from the one we've got? It so happened it didn't come to that point because they lost the elections of 2004. But I'm just saying, systems can be changed. The question is, of course, that processes have to be gone through before they're changed. Ultimately, though, we have to preserve the right of the people to determine their own political destiny for themselves. That's the core definition of democracy. It is ruled by the people, of the people, for the people, the famous line of Abraham Lincoln's. And for that, which form it takes is less important than that kernel of essential popular control. And that, I think, we have to ensure we all have the right, certainly under our present system and in the Constitution, we have the right to do that, to ensure we preserve democracy. And don't let anyone take it away.
Thank you very much, Shashi Tharoor. We're right on time. We have literally 1 second left. See? My favorite quote from your book is this one. If you're a dog lover, you'll like this. Every day has its dog. I just wanted to end with that. It has a lovely
That's a
illustration.
Joseph one too. but
Yeah, it has a lovely illustration of the dog who's eaten the sofa and he's got toilet paper all over him and stuff like that. So if you're a dog lover like me, you'll get this one. Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Shashi Tharoor.
And you know, Nidhi, there's that other one also from Joseph. If you think you like someone, get a second opinion about him from your dog.
I agree with that one too. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.